All right, so I apologize for that delay and having to restart this whole thing, but such is life. Today we're going to work on a little bit of Rhino, but a lot of V-Ray. And the purpose today is to control how a texture is applied to an object. And you guys already kept asking me the last couple of classes, well, wait a minute, the bricks are too large. How do I make them smaller? How do I, it doesn't look right. So today's about something called texture mapping. And that is, how does a texture apply to an object? How frequently does it repeat? What is the scale of the object versus what is the scale of the texture, etc. So we're going to spend some time using a variety of different materials and kind of exploring what those options are and how they're applied to a particular scene. So to get started, under part 1, I'm going to have you create some basic shapes, kind of like we did in the last one where we had those basic shapes and we applied some materials to them when we were learning. But I'm a little more specific about what we want. So I want a cube, a sphere, a circle, a cone, and a pyramid, and a wall-shaped rectangle that's 12 feet by 1 foot by 8 feet. So I'm going to start with that wall-shaped rectangle. I'll use the rectangle tool here. I'm going to work in the perspective. And wherever I start, I'll use my relative coordinates here. So I'll use at, and this is going to be, what did I say it was, 12 feet, comma, 1 foot. And then it's going to be 8 feet tall, so I type in 8 feet there. I do need to turn off that OpenGL problem so that I see all of my objects. So let me go up into my tools, options, and then down here under View, and OpenGL, I'm going to uncheck the GPU tessellation option. And there we go. Now I'm actually seeing the whole thing. And we can go ahead and for now switch into shaded mode for our display. And there is my wall-shaped object behind. Then the rest of these objects, I'll start with just the box corner to corner. It's going to be a 4 foot, so at 4 feet, comma 4 feet. And then we'll do it about 4 feet tall. That was not 4 feet tall. Let's try that one more time. There it is. So I have a cube. I need a sphere. So we'll go in here. Again, under my standard primitives, I'll come over to my sphere. And that should be about 4 feet in diameter. So right now the radius is set to, it's set to radius, so it would be 2 feet to get the 4 foot sphere. And again, these are all approximate. That sphere is below the ground. We can see it in my side view. So I want to move that up so that it's at least at ground level, maybe slightly floating. Then we'll come back here. I have a cone and I have a pyramid. So again, these are under my standard primitives. I'll pick the cone right there. And the same general idea here. My radius, we'll say, is 2 feet. And my height is, that was not what I wanted. I want my height to be 4 feet. There's my cone. And then my pyramid, again under standard, there's my pyramid. Notice here that I can choose a number of sides. I'm going to set my number of sides to 4, so it's a traditional pyramid. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing here. This is going to be 2 feet. And we'll come up by 4 feet there. So those are all just objects. The reason I'm picking this grouping of objects is so that we can actually talk through what, did I not do a cylinder? I need a cylinder too. So I can talk to you through how these textures apply on various objects. So let me do a cylinder here. I'm just turning on my object snaps. There we go. So I don't even really care so much about the composition of these objects. It's just about how the textures are going to apply. In order to do renderings of these, though, I need some basic environmental parameters. We've done this before, but it's always good to double check. I will create a layer called environment, and then a sublayer for infinite plane. I can just call it IP, and a sublayer for light. I will take those 2 layers and drag them so that they're on top of environment, therefore making them 2 sublayers. We'll make the infinite plane layer active, and then I'll go ahead and click to add the V-Ray infinite plane. There it is. If I don't want to see it in purple, I can of course change the color of the layer to be black, and that'll make it kind of a nice gray. And then on my light, we're going to set up the light using a box as a guide. So let me make light the active layer. We'll set up my box here. And then I'm going to use my basic directional light. It's the one with all the arrows right here. And we'll go from, of course I put it right in the wrong spot. There we go. We go basic directional light, snap to the low corner, snap to the high corner, and then I'll go ahead and delete the box. So I have that light kind of generally pointing down at my scene. So that then sets up the scene for me to practice rendering and to start to explore materials. So I do need to make sure that I have the infinite plane and the light installed. That's so that it previews more accurately. I can also go ahead and I can lock the environment layer. Oops, let me move back to the default layer here. And I'll lock the environment layer so I can't accidentally select the infinite plane or the light. They just exist for me. Okay, so all of that is set up. And at this point, I'm going to start to work with my materials. Now, in the interest of clarity, I'm going to work with one object at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything but the cube. And then I'll type in hide. You don't have to. You can put them on separate layers. I just want to do this for clarity purposes as I start to explore these materials. So once I have this, I need to assign this object a material that has a distinct repetitive pattern, because it's going to be important to see that so you can kind of see general scale and what it's going to look like. So I'm going to go ahead and open my V-Ray Asset Editor, which is this first button here on the V-Ray toolbar. And then in the V-Ray Asset Editor, I need to find a material. I'm going to use one of the presets here. So I've expanded my list to the left, and then I need to pick a preset. So I'm not looking at things like car paint that are uniform in color. I need something with a lot of texture. So bricks would be good examples. There may be some siding in here. I have some siding. A wood or a laminate might be good. So one of these patterns. And then I have a bunch of examples on my flash drive as well. I'm going to go ahead and start with the brick. I think that'll be a pretty easy one to see. And I might switch it up and show you some of the other ones. Now, there's a bunch of different styles of bricks that I can pick from down here. I'm going to do a traditional brick, this red brick here, and we'll go ahead and drop it over. I should see a little preview of what those bricks look like. Okay, that's reasonable. And now I want to assign those bricks to this object. So I'll select the object, then I'll right-click on the bricks and say Apply Material to Selection. And now it's been applied. Now in order to see this, I'm going to go ahead and move in my view from shaded down one to rendered. And this is going to give me a rendered preview, I hope, there we go, of what this looks like. It should be fairly easy to see because of the way we've set up the scene. So I should be able to see my material all the way around. Sometimes the rendered preview gets a little wonky and you won't be able to see your object, or it'll be too dark. That's unfortunately sometimes the artifact of the rendering process. So if I were to look at this particular object, we can see that it has a texture applied. Generally speaking, by default, it kind of wraps around the object, but the top, this brick looks significantly larger than any of the side bricks. So it's not applying to my object quite right. Furthermore, we know this object is 4 feet tall, and so these bricks would be really massive bricks. So we need to adjust the scale of how the texture applies to the object as a whole. I've started with the simplest object, which is just the cube. And so we're working with that. So if I were to select the cube, right there, we can see that it's highlighted in yellow. I can then come over to my properties. So I'm going to click off of the layers for a second. Click over into my properties. This gives us basic properties about my object, like what layer it's on, etc. But there are some other properties related to it. So instead of doing the object properties, I can come over. The next one is material. And the one after that is called texture mapping. That's how we're applying the texture to the object. So I'm going to come over to that texture mapping and click on it. Now when I click on the texture mapping, I'll make this a little bit bigger. Hopefully you can see it a little bit better there. When I click on that texture mapping button here, you'll see that directly below that I have a series of, they're kind of like presets. They're predefined texture maps that I can use. And so this controls how the material is applied on the object itself. I'm going to illustrate a couple points here. The first one, and this one is not the one I'll ultimately use, is something called planar mapping. So it's this first, it's not the surface mapping, it's the next one over called planar mapping. And this is probably similar to what's happening already on this particular surface. So when I click on that button, I need to look up at my command line, and it's going to ask me for first corner of plane or give me a bounding box. Generally speaking, bounding box will work. It just gives you a box around your object. So I'll go ahead and click on bounding box. It's going to ask me the coordinate system to use, whether it's the C-plane or the world. Typically, we're just going to stick with the default of world here. And then it asks me a UV or a UVW. Just click on UVW for right now. I will explain that later on. So once I've done that and applied that mapping to this object, I want to explain what's happening. So what it did is it said, okay, I'm going to take the texture of my object, and I'm going to pretend like I'm shining a light through that texture and project it straight down on the object. And it makes that pattern appear on the object, kind of like the projector makes the picture appear on the chalkboard. Okay? Now it's applying directly on that surface. But when we get to one of the sides, it's going to take whatever the pixels are on the edge and basically streak them all the way down, as if the paint just dripped off the side. So I'm getting a streak from whatever that texture was. So here, in this particular case, there's a grout joint in between the bricks, so I'm getting white coming all the way down. Here I've got a brick, so that's coming all the way down. So depending on what you're seeing, that's what we're getting. Likewise, on the end here, I'm getting, my texture falls on that seam, therefore I'm getting the grout following straight down the side. So it's whatever the pixel is going straight down the side. This is not, by any means, the most attractive way of applying texture mapping to this particular object, but it illustrates the style of texture mapping that it's applying to. So if I had just a surface at the top, just a single surface, and I wanted a picture to be applied to it, for example, I could just apply this kind of a planar mapping to that one surface and have, if it didn't have any thickness to it, it would just stick on there. So that's certainly one strategy. I don't want this long term, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this texture mapping. So the object is still shown. I'll come back over into my texture mapping toolbar here, and I'm going to click on the delete texture mapping option, which is right there. So when I click on that, the texture mapping goes away, and I get back to the default mapping, which we're seeing right here. So this shape, the cube, most closely resembles, guess what? A box. So really the ideal choice of what kind of texture mapping is the shape that most closely resembles your object. So in this case, it's a box. So I would go ahead and click on that Apply Box Mapping button. I'll look up here at my command line, and it says first corner of base, or do you want to just pick a bounding box? Like I said, almost always we just pick the bounding box. So I'll go ahead and click on bounding box. Coordinate system is going to be world. Do I want it capped? That means, do I want a texture on top or not? Yes, I do want it to be capped because I want a texture to go on top. And as soon as I've done that, if we start to look at this object, we say, oh, well, wait a minute. This starts to feel more appropriate in its scale, certainly in how it's applying. The brick dimension here matches the brick dimension up here, which matches the brick dimension right here. So it's consistent across the whole object. Now, it's applying to this object, and it actually is wrapping around that grout joint right there and continuing to go along the top surface. Given the pattern and the repetition, one edge or the other isn't going to be able to wrap. So in this case, it wraps up and over, but this comes up and stops and doesn't continue to wrap because of the nature of the texture. So we're kind of stuck with it looking that way. You could think about it if you were wrapping like a box with wrapping paper. You can't, at some point, you have to fold the ends. So we're doing the same thing. So there's a hard seam there. Now, if we look here at the options related to our texture mapping here, we can see here under X, Y, Z size that it actually has filled in inches what the dimensions of this object are. So in this case, it's 48 inches by 48 inches by 48 inches, which is great. So we didn't have to do anything. I will come back to this XYZ size when we don't have a cube. By default, we have a cube. It's filled it in. We don't have to worry about it. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Now down here, we have a Uvw Offset, we have a Uvw Repeat, and a Uvw Rotation. So UV and W is kind of like X, Y, and Z, but it's dealing with the texture map, not with the true X, Y, and Z of our scene. So it has to do with the object itself. So over here under our Uvw Repeat, if we were to change one of these values, we would change how the texture repeats on our object. So if I pick this first one here and I said, you know what, I want that to be 2.0 instead of 1.0, we would see that it squishes. I'm getting 2 repetitions of the pattern in this direction, 2 repetitions in this direction, and 2 repetitions in that direction. But it's still 1 in the other 2, in the other 2 options. So if let me go back to 1. Generally speaking, you're going to want to have things stay in proportion, and if that's the case, you can click this little checkbox for lock, and when you do that, you can change the repeat as a whole. So I can say I want the UVW to bump up to 2.0, and you'll see that the bricks stay in proportion, but I get twice as many bricks on this particular object. So if I had an understanding of how big 4 feet is and how many repetitions of bricks I want, I could calculate out what an appropriate size would be for this. So this is probably too dense. The bricks would be too small. So it's probably somewhere more like 1.25 to get the correct number of bricks for the size of this object. And this is just kind of an intuitive guess on my part. But you can see that I can keep adjusting, so I could go to 1.5 and we get more bricks. So it's going to keep adjusting 1.1. You get the idea. So I can control how many times the pattern repeats. And that's what this value is for. So let me go back up to 1.25. I think that's pretty good. There it is. And then I have a UVW rotation value. It doesn't do a lot for us to rotate this value. Sorry. But I can attempt to rotate it. I don't like to use this UVW rotation. I'm going to show you how I would go about rotating it in just a second. But you can try out these numbers. So for example, I could try the W rotation value. I could set it to 90, and it's going to change which way the pattern is repeating. So in this case, I've rotated by 90 degrees. The pattern continues this way instead of running across horizontally. And I'll go back to 0. A lot of times with this, it's easier just to explain it as try one of the values and see what happens, and do you like it or do you not like it. So in that case, I don't like it, so we'll go back. I could try this one at 90, and it's the same thing. I don't like the values. So it's usually pretty self-explanatory as to which one you can make adjustments to. So I'm going to go back to 0 there. Okay? The Uvw offset just has to do with where the pattern starts and ends. But it's, again, on something like these bricks, it's not particularly relevant to what we're trying to do. So I'm going to go ahead and hit escape. I'm going to zoom back out here, and I'm going to type in show to show in all the rest of my objects. So I'm going to move on to the wall object. So I'll take the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, and the pyramid, and I'll go ahead and type hide. So I'm left with just the wall itself right there. Now with this wall selected, I'm going to again apply a material first. So I'll click on my V-Ray Asset Editor. I'll use the same bricks. So I'll right click and say apply to selection. And there we go. And I have similar problems here with how this is being applied. So this object, again, if I select it and I come over to my object properties and then texture mapping, this object, again, even though it's longer and skinnier than a box, is essentially a box. It's just a little bit different proportions. So again, applying the box mapping to it makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Apply Box Mapping. It's going to ask me for the first corner of the base, or I can again use the bounding box. I would recommend the bounding box. Coordinate system will be world, and yes, I want it to be capped. So now in this sense, it's gone ahead and it's applied the texture to each side in the same manner, but notice that each time I'm getting a repeat of the pattern basically once. So I have once it's showing on the front here. I have the same image squished to fit on the side, and I have the same image really squished to fit on the top. So this doesn't necessarily look as realistic as it probably should. So that's where I told you I was going to come back to this XYZ size. So in this scenario, under XYZ size, I have the dimensions of my shape, 144 by 12 by 96. I have some options here. This button here gives me the size of the object, so that's what it's currently set at. And so I can always click on that and go back to it. That's the nice thing about these tools, is I can reset if I don't like something. The 1 to 1 to 1 is going to reset all of these to 1, and it's going to repeat the pattern as if it's a 1-inch square. So if I click on that, my bricks are there, but they're going to be really, really tiny, and I would have to zoom in to see them. Okay? So they are there, but it's pretty difficult to see them. So let me go back to this button, which goes back to the size of my object. Now there's one button in the middle, and that is x equals y equals z. And so it's going to reset these to be an average of the three sides, but it'll make them all the same. So when I click on that, it's going to average out at 84 inches. And now if I look at it, we can see that, yeah, the texture actually wraps around. It seems appropriate. The texture looks reasonable on top. But I still might not like the scale. Maybe the objects are a little bit too big. In that scenario, I can come down to my Uvw Repeat again. I'm going to lock them, and then I'm going to control the repeat. So maybe I'll go to 2. Now that looks a lot more appropriate for the size of the wall. So again, you can adjust this in fine increments. So 2.1 gives me a few more bricks. 1.9 would give me a few less bricks. So you can decide what's appropriate based on the size of your wall. If you were really getting technical, you could count how many courses, and you could do the math based on the course plus the mortar on how big that should be per foot, and then you could adjust as appropriate. This is approximate, and so it's reasonable for what we're looking at. It's probably, to my eye, it's probably a little bit more like 2, maybe 2.1 or something like that to see it. So we've now applied this, and it wraps all the way around the object on all sides, and it wraps up and over the top of the object here. So what if I really don't like the placement? What if I don't like where this seam is happening, or I don't like where this seam is happening, and I want to adjust that? I can do that by using a special little widget that I can make show up. So that widget is available right here. It's called Show Mapping. And when I click on that Show Mapping, it's going to give me this yellow dotted cube. And that yellow dotted cube represents the mapping that's been applied to this object. It is currently 84 inches on a side. I can manipulate this object just as I do any other object in Rhino. Yeah?
If that widget is grayed out, is there anything we should do?
Do you have your mapping applied already?
It is, yeah.
I don't know. I'll have to come see why it is. So there it is, and I can manipulate this just as I would any object. So I can, for example, move it by typing move. I can snap to it, and I can move it. And as I move it, you can see that the texture itself is moving. So I can control where those bricks fall, and certainly where those bricks fall on that front edge. So if I wanted the bricks to come up and flow seamlessly across that corner, I could move this object so that, for example, it was right in that corner, and suddenly the bricks would flow up and over because they match up with that corner of the object. They would not match up on the backside because of the scale of the object. And they would continue to flow around the object that way. So there's one other trick to manipulating this object, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit more. I've just moved it back so you can hopefully see it a little bit better. And that is using something called the gumball. And it's right down here at the bottom. It's right in the center, and it's a toggle that we can turn on and turn off. Now, some people, and now's my time where I'm going to introduce the concept of the gumball to you. Some people absolutely love this, and they want to use it all the time, and they want to manipulate their objects with it, and it just makes intuitive sense for them. I can't stand it, except in this scenario. So it's a personal preference. So if this is something that you like and you want to work with, you can use it. There's no problem with it. now that I've introduced it as a concept. What the gumball is a little widget that shows up that has a blue arrow, a green arrow, and a red arrow. You can move your objects along axes by clicking on any one of those arrows and dragging. If you click on the arrow, you can then type in a value that you want it to move. So I could say move 4 inches, and it will move 4 inches. Likewise, I can rotate the object along any one of these little arcs here. So I could say, you know what, I want to rotate this object along the red axis, and it's going to rotate the object along that axis, and which is obviously affecting what the texture looks like. I think it's predominantly, you can see it on the end there as you're controlling how it wraps around the corner. You can also click on and type in a value for it. So I could say I want it to rotate by 45 degrees or something like that. So this widget can be a really unique way of kind of adjusting how something is applied. Now, of course, you can get things really messed up pretty easily if you want to. So in this scenario, maybe I messed that up too far. Sometimes it's easiest to just hide the widget and then go back to your properties. Oops, sorry, I have to select it, and then delete the mapping altogether, and then reapply the mapping. So let me turn off gumball. I've deleted the mapping. I can go back and apply a box map, bounding box, world capped, and then I can come back here, x equals y equals z, and now I'm back to where I was. I can come back and I can turn back on my widget, and then I can manipulate my widget in the same way. Oops, helps if I can type. And I can make that line up right there. And what was my Uvw Repeat was, what, 2, I think? And now I'm back to that particular object. So when I'm done working and manipulating the object, I can select the object and then go back to hide mapping, which makes the mapping go away for that particular object. At this point, I can go ahead and click show. That will bring all of my objects back. And I'm going to work on the cylinder. So I'll select everything but the cylinder. And we'll type hide. And now we have the cylinder to work with. So let me type Z for zoom followed by S for selected. So we're recentering around this particular object. And then we need to apply the material to this object as well. So I have it selected. I'm going to open up my V-Ray asset editor. I'll right click on my bricks material and say apply to selection. Now it's applying to this. And in this context, it's not really too bad other than the top is a different scale than the side bricks. So with the object selected, I can again go to my texture mapping window over here. And on the right side, I'm not going to pick a box map this time because it doesn't resemble the cylinder. I'm going to keep going, and there, lo and behold, is a cylindrical map. So I'll go ahead and click on the cylindrical map. And when I do that, I again come up to my command line here. It says base of cylinder or, once again, bounding box. Bounding box is always nice, so we'll just do bounding box. Coordinate system, do I want it to be C-plane or world? We'll stick with world. Do I want it to be capped? Yes or no? Yes, let's go ahead and cap it. And as soon as I do that, it's now applied the material. Now in this case, it's stretching and applying it around the cylinder as one repetition. So my material goes around it as one. If I come in here and I want to change the Uvw Repeat, I can then change it to, say, 2, and it's going to get a little bit more dense. This one's a little bit trickier, though, because you see how much it's stretching as it goes around the particular cylinder. So sometimes here, this is where you really need to adjust these on a more individual basis. So instead of doing 2 for everything, I might do, let's say, 4 and 4. And I'm not adjusting. I might have done that backwards. Let's see here. Let me just reset these to 1. All right, so we're back to 1s. And then let's see here. Let's adjust the Z. try adjusting this. Nope, still doesn't like me. So this might be an opportunity where dealing with the mapping directly is a good idea, because I can't seem to get it to look the way I want it to look. So I'm going to go back to them all being equal, x equals y equals z. Then I'll go ahead and show my custom mapping. There's my cylinder. And I can work with that cylinder to adjust it. So let me go in and use my gumball. There it is. And I want to scale all 3 of the dimensions at once here. So let's see. No, it doesn't like me. Hold on a second. It's not going to let me do it at all. I'm going to do a regular scale instead. And let me choose the center of that object. There we go. And we can shrink it down and see what it would look like. We can also raise it up and see what it would look like there. There's a happy medium where this starts to look right. So maybe it's about like that. And then I can change the Uvw Repeat up. Oops, this needs to be for all of them. There we go. So finding the right scale, now those look more appropriate, like they're bricks. Notice, though, that I can also take this widget and I can move it, which would cause some of the bricks to be compressed on one side and some of them to be elongated on the other side. So where that widget falls matters. Okay? So anyway, that's a cylinder. I can also, of course, rotate the cylinder like I've done before and totally get, bizarre results as these kinds of things come together. But this is an example of where a cylindrical map really starts to make more sense on a cylinder. You wouldn't rotate the cylinder unless you rotated the whole object. So let me undo that, and I'll undo that again. And we're back looking at our object. Okay, that looks pretty good. So at this point, I'll hide my mapping, and we'll go ahead and show the rest of the objects. Oops. Not responding. I love it. This is the way my day's gone today so far. So. Okay, so I just really quickly recreated this whole thing. Like I said, I apologize. My computer's been a little funky today. Anyway, so we're moving on. We're moving to the sphere here. I'm going to switch over into the render mode. And then I'm going to apply the brick texture to the sphere. So I'll go back to my V-Ray asset editor. I'm going to right-click on the bricks and say Apply Material, Apply to Selection. There it is. Now, the bricks and a sphere are inherently difficult to come together because typically bricks aren't going to be laid in a sphere. So no matter how we do it, we're going to end up with some stretching on the pattern. It's kind of like if you imagine trying to peel an orange. Like, it's a hard thing to texture. So a texture that doesn't have this same kind of a pattern would be good, like texturing an orange, for example. So anyway, but I still have to kind of work with it. I'm going to go into my texture mapping. So I'll click on my properties. I'll go to texture mapping here. Make this a little bit wider here. There we go. Too wide. Trying to be consistent there. And so the closest object that I have is the spherical mapping. So I'll go ahead and click on the Apply Spherical Mapping. Once again, it's going to be bounding box, world, and now it's been applied. Nothing much has changed, but I now do have some options. So my XYZ size is set at 48. My Uvw Repeat, if I check the lock button, I could increase the number of times the pattern falls on this particular object. And you can, of course, see that it stretches as it gets, or it compresses as it gets toward the poles and stretches out as it gets toward the middle. If I show the mapping on this, the mapping looks very much like the mapping on this, or like the sphere itself, but I can also rotate, how that mapping is applied, etc. So there's not too much I can do because it's just the nature of the shape in terms of making it look, quote, more realistic than it currently does. So I've done that one. Let me go ahead and hide that. Oops, sorry. Take the object and hide it. There There we go. And we'll move on to the cone. So I'm going to take this cone here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'll open my V-Ray Asset Editor. I'll click on the bricks here. I'll right-click and say Apply to Selection. And there it is. So now this one is kind of difficult because it's kind of like a cylinder, but it also is kind of not like a cylinder. And so it's an inherently difficult one to figure out how do you want to texture map it. So if you take this object and you apply a cylindrical map to it, we can again use our bounding box just like we've done before, world. And in this case, do we want it capped? That's again kind of an iffy one. I'm guessing no, but let me go ahead and click yes to take a look at what happens. So when I click yes, it put a cap on the bottom of that shape, and it made all of my rings concentric here, which is kind of reasonable and ended up looking out okay. Alternatively, if I came back and I said, let's do a cylindrical map here, we'll do a bounding box, world, and no, I don't want it capped, we're going to get an end result that's kind of similar because, again, the top doesn't have a cap on it. So it's a weird kind of, it doesn't make as much difference as you would think setting something like this up. Same things applies. It's already set at 48, 48, 48. My Uvw Repeat, I could up that to get more tiers. Oh, sorry, I didn't lock them all together here. Something like that I could do, and it looks reasonable, but there's always going to be distortion at the bottom and distortion at the top. Now, depending on how I want this texture map to be applied, I can spend a little bit more time and adjust it. I think it's easier to see it when we go over and do it on a pyramid. So I'm going to leave the cone there for a second, and I'm going to look at the pyramid here. And so when I go ahead and apply this texture map, this one is really difficult to deal with because it could be a box map, it could be a cylindrical map, but it's got the hard corners. So this is a case where really thinking about how you want a texture map is probably more sophisticated than any of the presets that are available here. So rather than picking one of the presets, I'm going to use one of my other tools, which is called Unwrap. It looks like a little package here in the upper corner. And when I click on Unwrap, it's going to ask me to select the seams. So you guys remember back to, I think it's 130, where you guys had to do the drafted shapes and you cut them out and you folded them and they glued together. That's essentially what we're doing with this particular shape. So we can choose how do we want this to be split apart. So when it asks for the seams, maybe I'll pick this edge as a seam, and then yeah, go ahead and cut it along that seam, and that seam. So when that happens, it's going to unfold this and keep some of my object together, and it's going to cut where I've made those yellow seams. I'm going to go ahead and press Enter on it. Oh, and I should have put a material on it first. Hold on. And so where I chose, let me increase the scale here just so that you can see it a little bit easier. There we go. So where I chose to make the seam, which was that edge, that's going to be a seam. But the rest of it, the texture is actually going to flow all the way across and all the way around the rest of the objects. So I've sacrificed that one area right here where the texture doesn't match up anymore. But as long as I'm looking at the object from this side, let me unselect it, you can see that the texture wraps all the way around the object that way. So it's a way of controlling. Furthermore, it wraps to the bottom too. But it would wrap off of the side that didn't have the, I think it's this side was the one that didn't have the seam. Yeah, that's where it connects off of that one. So I can show this in a little bit more controlled manner if I want to. So if I select the object again, I'm going to turn off the gumball for right now so it's not as distracting. And I can come over here to this UV editor. And this will allow me to basically create a temporary rectangle that shows my object. And let me, for our purposes right now, I'm going to turn off my environment so you can see this a little bit easier. And when I turn off that environment, it's going to show me the unrolled shape. So there's my unrolled shape and how it's applying to the texture itself. Do you guys see that? So if I wanted the texture to be a little bit different, I can actually come in here and I can rotate it so that maybe maybe I want that edge to be right along there, and it's going to rotate the object or the texture on the object over here. So it's a very fine-grained control over an object. But again, this is always for a specialty case. Like you're doing some kind of very small object, and you want to control how, you know, the wood texture wraps around the handle of a pair of scissors or something. That's where something like this would happen. For the most part, the kinds of objects that you're going to make will fall under the major categories. Box, lots of boxes. Cylinder, lots of cylinder type objects. Or maybe some spheres, depending on the curvature. That's pretty much the bulk of all your texture mapping right there. So if you really understand box, sphere, and cylinder, you can pretty much cover everything, unless you're trying to do something very specific like this, which is why I like to kind of show you how this works, just so that you can see it in kind of a live format, because it gives you that kind of custom setup. We could do the same thing with the cone like we did with the pyramid. Same concept where we unroll the surface. Okay, so that's how you would apply the texture mapping. When I'm done, I go ahead and click apply, and it now applies, and I can see my object as it's set up. I can turn back on my infinite plane to get a little bit of shadow context, and there it is. Okay, so you've worked your way through kind of understanding how the texture mapping works on all of these objects. You'll do a little render at the end with all of your objects just so we can prove that it works. I wouldn't mind if you played around with a few other materials just to kind of make sure you're really understanding this. Remember, a day like today, this is really about understanding the concept of texture mapping, so that when you're working on your assignment, for example, you understand how to put appropriate texture mapping. I can't tell you how many times grades get dropped or docked on assignment 201 because the texture mapping is too big in scale, because you didn't apply it. So remember, it should look appropriate to the size of the object. No giant wood grain on the side arm of your chair, because that, you know, it needs to be smaller because it's wood at an appropriate scale. It's not a miniature chair, it's a full-size chair. Anyway, so continuing on. The next thing that I want you to do is I want you to open up, and I'm not going to worry about saving it. You guys will save it. You'll do your rendering. You'll post. I'm confident you can do that. I'm going to have you open up your bridge from last class. So I'll go ahead and I'll go onto my flash drive here. Sorry, it was 2 classes ago. Let me go into my files here. Let's see here. There's my bridge that I was working on. And I'm going to end up using this bridge, or versions of this bridge, in a brand new file. And I'm going to do that using a block reference. So in order to do that, I need to clean up this file so that it's ready to use. So a few things I don't need. One, I don't need this extra, I don't need the infinite plane, so we can select it and delete it. I also don't need this extra little bit here, so we'll go ahead and delete that. I have my object itself, but let's go ahead and clean that up. Instead of being on the default layer, maybe I'll rename that layer to be bridge. There it is. I don't need all these extra layers, so let's go ahead and clean those up as well. So I'm really trying to clean before I end up using it. Furthermore, I want to think about how these objects are going to come together. How am I going to glue them together? That point is a pretty good point to snap to and from. So I'm going to take that and I will move it from that point right there to 0, 0, 0. So when I end up inserting it later on, I'll have a point to copy from, and that'll be 0, 0. That's where it's going to come in. So the next piece of this would be to apply the textures to this and the texture mapping. So I'll go into my V-Ray asset editor. How convenient. It's giving me the hiding everything on me. I go to my materials here, and I'm not going to do it in brick. I'll do it in concrete. All right, there's concrete. I'm going to go ahead and apply that concrete to this bridge. So I can do that in one of 2 ways. I could select the object and then right-click and say apply, or I could apply this to the whole layer. So I can apply to layer. There's only one layer in this file, so it's called the bridge. So all of that is now going to be applied on that particular layer. I can switch over into my rendered mode to get a preview of what this looks like. So it's not too bad from a texture standpoint, but we can see that the texture doesn't flow from this surface to this surface. So I really want to do a texture map. Likewise, it doesn't flow across the top here. So when I'm doing the texture map, I have a couple options. I could set the texture map for one surface, or I can do the texture map for the whole object. And so in our case, I think it's easiest to do it for the whole object. So I will select the whole object. I'll go to my properties. I'll go into my texture mapping. Then the closest object would be a box to it. So I'll click on box mapping. It's going to ask me first corner of base, or do I want a bounding box? We'll do a bounding box. Coordinate system world, do I want it to be capped? Yes, I do. And now if we look at the side, we can see that the texture ends up being seamless as it goes over that particular side. Likewise, it's reasonable as it goes over the top. That one's a little bit harder to fold over, and that one's a little bit harder as well. But it looks pretty reasonable. The scale seems pretty reasonable. Remember, I can select my object, and I could come in here, and I could adjust the scale to 1.5 if I wanted the texture to be a little bit smaller, which might be appropriate. And now that I've set up my texture mapping, I'm happy with it. I can go ahead and I can save this. I'm going to do a file, save as, and I'm going to put that into today's folder. So we'll jump up to 207. And we'll go ahead and I'll save this as bridge. And there it is. So it's saved. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the glass spider clamp that we did before. I'll go to File and then Open. And that was in, what was it, 206 here. And there's my sample. Same thing in this case. I don't need the infinite plane anymore, so I can select the infinite plane and delete it. I don't need my directional light. I can select that and delete it as well. This time I'm going to separate my objects into two because I have a material for the glass and I have a material for the spider clamp. So I might call this one spider clamp. And I might change layer 1 to be called glass. I'll change this object onto the glass layer. There it is. And then I might make layer 2 here, I might call, say, curtain wall. And I might make the spider clamp and the glass both sublayers of the curtain wall. Again, it's all about organization. When you start to bring in blocks, the more organization you have, the better the easier it is going to be to work with your files. So I'm going to delete those extra layers. So I'm down to just curtain wall. I have a spider clamp and I have the glass. I need to apply materials to these objects. So I'll click on my V-Ray material editor, open up my V-Ray materials. Under glass here, a lot of you guys played around with this last class. Picking a glass that has some color to it is good at this point because we have no background context. So I'll use the tempered glass as my example here. I'm going to right click on the tempered glass and say apply to layer. This is going to be on the glass layer. There it is. The next thing is I need some metal for the clamp itself. Gold is probably not the appropriate metal color. I'm going to do kind of a dark bronze, something like that. And then I will right click on it and I will say apply to layer and we'll say this is going to go on the spider clamp itself. Now in this case, the two materials that I've chosen, even if I switch over into rendered mode for a second, there's not really any texture mapping necessary because the glass is glass. We're not going to see any pattern repetition or anything. And likewise, the metal is kind of in the same boat. I'm not going to see too much pattern repetition in the metal. So there's not a lot of texture mapping necessary. So this one is ready as is. The only thing I might do is I might take this whole thing and I might move it such that this corner right here is at 0, 0, 0. and then I might go ahead and save it. So I'll go ahead and go to File and then Save As. And this is going to go into today's exercise as well here. And this is the curtain wall. And I'll go ahead and save that. So I have the bridge and I have the curtain wall saved. Now I'm going to create a file that has the environment in it so that I can bring the curtain wall and the bridge into that file. So I'm going to create a brand new file. I'll go to File and then New. And this is designed to introduce the concept of blocks. I'm going to use a large object inches template. And in this particular scene, we can go ahead and make the perspective view large. I'm going to have a layer for environment. I'm going to have a sublayer here for infinite plane. I'll just call it IP. I'll have another sublayer here for light. We'll make the infinite plane and the light layer sublayers of environment. There they are. And then on the infinite plane layer, I can go ahead and add in that V-Ray infinite plane right there. And on the light layer, I can go ahead and set up the basic directional light. There it is. And I'll do that with the directional light tool right here, shining down on my object. Actually, I'm going to have the light shining the opposite direction. I'm going to go that way and that way. And then I'll go ahead and delete that object. So I've set up my scene. I have an environment, I have an infinite plane, I have a light. I'm going to bring in the bridge and I'm going to bring in the wall as a block reference. So if you've worked in AutoCAD before, this is like an XREF, where we're referencing an external file and bringing it in. I'm going to give myself a layer for these blocks. So on layer 4 here, I'm just going to call it blocks. And I'm going to make it the active layer. There it is. Now it's time to bring in those objects. And I can actually switch this into shaded mode so we could see it, or I could switch it into rendered mode long term. Let me change the color of that infinite plane from being purple. It's just awful. There we go. So now it's time to bring those in. To bring those two pieces in, I'm going to go to the Edit menu, and I'm going to go to Blocks, and I'll choose Insert Block Instance. This is something we're going to do a lot in this class, so you'll get really familiar with doing this and bringing them in. It helps a lot with your organization. So this Insert menu is going to first ask me for the file. So I need to go browse for the file. I'll click the little folder icon here and browse for my file. This means that when I go to open this file again, I need to have the bridge file available. It needs to be in the same place, and it needs to be on the same drive letter. So when you go to, hold your question for just a second. If you go into the other lab to work and you plug in your flash drive and you notice that it's not the I drive anymore, it's the F drive, unplug it, plug it in until you get the I drive, because otherwise it's going to lose your block references. Yeah?
Where was the insert?
Go to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. Alternatively, you could press Control-I or type Insert. So right here in the Insert dialog box, I need to browse for my file. This is where I'm going to go find my bridge file. So let me go into my demonstrations here, into today's folder, and there's the bridge. I'll go ahead and click on Open, and it's going to bring up this Insert File Options. This is actually very, very important. So it gives me the ability to name it. That isn't important. Down here, it gives me a couple options. So block definition type. Do I want it to be embedded? Do I want it to be embedded and linked? Or do I want it to be just linked? So there's three different options, and they mean three different things. So the first one is embedded. That means take my bridge and permanently put it in this file. It's still a block, but it's now permanently in this file. So it's saved with the file. It has no further affiliation with your original file. It's as if you copied and pasted it and brought it in that way. The next option down here is embed it, but maintain a link to my original file. So if I don't have my original file, I still have my object in the scene, but if I want to make changes to the original file, it will still update as it goes along. The last option is kind of like InDesign, maintain a link to my original file, but don't actually put my original file in this scene. So for our purposes today with this bridge, Doesn't really matter which one you pick. However, at the end of the semester, when you have, let's say, your artist's retreat and you're doing a sophisticated piece there, and you have 20 different light fixtures that have been installed and 14 pieces of furniture, all of which are complicated, and you go to bring them all in, if you embed all of those, it's going to keep slowing down. Every time you have more and more surfaces in Rhino, it's going to keep slowing down and causing more lag and more processing power. If you maintain the linked files, kind of like InDesign, when it goes to render, it goes and finds the full file and brings it in for you. So it really helps speed things up to maintain links rather than embedding. So I would strongly encourage you to get in the habit of choosing them as linked. So we're going to go ahead and choose linked today. And then under layer style here, we have two different layer styles, active and reference layers. I strongly prefer that you choose reference layers. It will make layers that don't look like these regular layers. They'll be grayed out at the bottom. You still have access to them. You can still manipulate them. You can still turn them on and off, but it distinctly separates them from the rest of the layers in your scene. And again, when you, in today's purposes, it doesn't really matter, but when you have a file that has 200, 300 layers, having them separated into what are active layers and what are reference layers can really help you find your objects. So I would encourage you to continue to choose reference. So it's linked and reference, and I'll go ahead and say OK. Once I've done that, I can say OK again, and it's going to let me put this into the scene. For our purposes right now, I can stick it anywhere in the scene. It doesn't matter. I'll go ahead and click, and it will go into the scene there. It's too low in the scene, so I need to raise it up. I can use the Move tool, followed by V for vertical, to raise that up so it's above the ground. Now that I have that, and you know what? Let me go ahead and lock my environment so that I can't accidentally select it. I can take this block, and notice when I select it, it selects the whole thing. I can't select the individual pieces of this block. It's just the whole object. I can take that block and I can copy it, and I can make these so that I end up with more and more of them, like that. Alternatively, I can do an array on this object, which is going to give me a number in a specified direction. So let me go ahead and type array. And this is a linear array. It's going to ask me for the number in the x direction first. Well, I just have 1 in the x direction, so we'll keep that. Number in the y direction, I don't know, 15. Number in the z direction, we're going to stick with 1. The y spacing, or first reference point. This is the spacing from right there to right there. And you can see it kind of live previews these. So I can say from right there to right there. It gives me them in pink to verify. This is where I could change, oh, you know what, I really only wanted 13. Or I really wanted 20. You can change how many. Let's go back down to 10. And I could also change the spacing again if I didn't like it. Once I'm done, I'll press Enter, and now I have all of those together, making that bridge. Now I was careful when I put it together to make these little, I didn't finish that corner, but to make these little notches where they come together. That's part of what adds to the realism when I put all of these together. If I switch these into rendered mode, the material came with it, the texture mapping came with it, so it's all going to render appropriately when I go to do it. Let me switch back into my shaded mode again, and let's bring in that curtain wall to go behind it. I'll go into Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. I'm going to browse for the curtain wall. It's going to be linked as a reference layer, and I'll say OK, and OK, and now there it is. Now this one isn't quite in the correct orientation, so I might need to do some rotations. So I'm going to go ahead and do rotate. It's just a regular rotate. And we're going to take that from being there to being there. So now it's going in the correct direction. And I'm going to do an array of this piece. So I will do the array. So I'll type array. Oops. Select objects. There's my block. I'll press Enter. number in the x direction. So I still only have 1 in the x direction. Number in the y direction. Well, let's do a few more. Let's do 20. Number in the z direction, I don't know, let's do 5. Y spacing or first reference point. So my y spacing is going to be from there to there. And my z spacing is going to be, again, from that corner. Oops, sorry, wrong view. Up to that corner. Now, assuming for the moment that I made this object correctly, when I'm done, I should see this coming together as a full curtain wall, where all of my little pieces line up, which looks about right. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. I'll press Enter, and that gives me the curtain wall with all the little spider clamps, and I've got my bridge in front of it. So now it's time that I've done that to set up this for a rendered view. So let's come in here. I'm going to render it something like about maybe like that. So I'll turn back on my environment's already there. It's ready to be seen. I could switch over into rendered view to get kind of a preview of what it would look like. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I would go ahead and do the full render. So I can click on the render icon here and start the rendering process. And so we can already see the clear glass. We can see our texture here. Everything looks appropriate. This is what we're going after. Now I want to point out some advantages to the blocks and how the blocks work. And that is that if you discover after the fact that, you know what, I really didn't like my bridge and I wanted to make a modification to it, or the fact that it's 36 inches tall and really should be 42 inches tall, so I need to modify it, I can go back and I can revisit the bridge itself. So let me open that again. And when I do this, I'm actually going to go back to Rhino on the desktop here and open a new Rhino so that I'm not going into File and Open. I'm leaving one file open, and then I'm opening Rhino again. So we'll go back, and we'll go back to my bridge. And maybe it'll load. There we go. So we're back in my bridge. Let me switch over into shaded mode so I can just see this really quick. Okay, let's say that I needed to put a little railing on top of this. So we could say, okay, let's use a box. And let's go there, and let's make that, let's do a 3.5 inches. And I'm going to double check scale 1D. To check what this width is. I don't know what it is. It should be 1.5 inches. All right, it is 1.5 inches. And then maybe I'll move this up by, I don't know, let's do 1.5 inches, sure. And let's move it over. Probably should have done this first. Let's snap it there, and then let's move it vertical by 1.5 inches. And there's a piece of like a little wood cap or something. Again, this is not aesthetic. This is just about illustrating the point. So I have that. Maybe it needs a little rod or something to hold it up. So I can come in here with a little rod of some kind, snap to the center. Let's do a diameter of, I don't know, 1 inch. And we'll come up to being right about there. So I just added that little piece of rail. Now I need to apply materials to this. So I'd go into my V-Ray, and I'd open up for my materials here. Let's go into wood. I'm going to use a veneer. We'll use this one. So there it is. I'm going to right-click on it and say Apply Material to Selection. That's going to apply the material to this object. Likewise, I would go into my metal, and maybe I'll pick the same metal that I had, if I can find it. there's the dark bronze. And maybe I'll apply that to this. Now, I applied those both as selections, but I could just as easily have done layers for each of those and applied them as layers, which might be a better organizational strategy. But anyway, for our purposes right now, they're fine. I'm going to go into my view here, and I'm going to change those into rendered so I can take kind of a look at what it looks like. So this veneer, I need to texture map it. So we'll select it, and we'll come over to our texture mapping. It's going to be like a box map, so I'll say apply box map. It'll be a bounding box, world. Yes, I want it capped. And then I need to control what the repeat on it is. And it probably also needs to be x equals y equals z. So in this scenario, I did x equals y equals z. My grain's going the wrong direction. I want that to be rotated. So here's an example where I could show the mapping. That gives me the little box. I could then rotate the mapping, and so here's an opportunity to use that gumball. I told you I don't like it except under certain circumstances like this. This makes it easy. So I'll type in 90 there, and now my grain, if I turn back off my gumball, is going the correct direction. And I might need to adjust the repeat value to be maybe 1.5. I can take a look at what it looks like. Yeah, it's feeling about right for the size there. Looks about right on top. Yeah, okay, I'm happy with that. This metal piece, I don't need to worry about. It's about the right scale anyway. I need a second copy of this over here. So I could take these two objects, I could mirror them. Come on, there we go. And I could put them on this side. Now, if this object here didn't have the same texture mapping, let's say I didn't mirror them, I just created it from scratch, I could take this object and I can match the texture mapping over here. So there's a match, let me take this object here, there's a match mapping little button. It's like a broom. And when I do that, it's going to say select source object, I can match it to that. So if I have mapping that looks good on one object, I can always jump over and match it to the other object, which saves you a lot of time long term. Okay, so I created those two upper rails like that. I'm happy with what they look like. I can go ahead and go to File and then Save, and that saves successfully. Now, I was editing the bridge, which is what it should be. If I jump back over into this file here, there's my final render. We'll go ahead and close that for right now. And I go back into my Edit Blocks Block Manager. We can look at the blocks and notice that the bridge says linked file is newer. Remember, I maintain that link. As soon as I saved it, it says, oh, I know that it's new, so let me go ahead and update it. When I update it, it's going to say, oh, there's a material conflict. I always say replace existing material and then apply all in case you made a change to the material. And lo and behold, as soon as I do that, this now matches up with the object that I just created, which helps this whole thing come together. Now, it looks like I have a little bit of a gap in between, so I've got some issues that I didn't quite resolve, but you get the point. So when you're working with these block references, if you get to the point where you want to make a change, it's really easy to make that change if you have it as a block reference. You make it once and it populates to all of your objects, no matter what it is that you want to do. If I wanted to punch a hole through the side of this object, all I have to do is punch the hole, and then it would be in all of them. So it's an easy way of manipulating the object and building up your pieces. I should hide that mapping before I lose track of it and have too many maps showing. So that's all done. I can come back here to my final version. I can go ahead, let me pan this just a little bit so that I'm not seeing the bottom quite as much as I would rather see it about like that. And then we can go ahead and perform that rendering one more time. This time with the little wood rails on top. This is what I'm going to save and what I'm going to post for today. Okay? So the beginning part is about understanding how to texture map. The next part is about applying the materials and then bringing these in as a block reference to give me this kind of a render at the end. Does that kind of make sense? Okay? I think you guys will breeze through exercise 208 next class. The good news is, yes, okay, technically I'm not here to lecture, but this is actually the first exercise where you have to kind of figure out how to model something on your own without me telling you how to do it. So it's a good time for you guys to be doing that. The 209, like I said, is the organic shapes. That's pretty scripted in terms of I'll walk you through how to make the cushions. The hard part about that is something called a network surface, which I think you guys will pick up okay on the video. The key there is just making sure you understand which direction the two curves are going. And so when you watch the video, that'll make sense. If you get stuck and you struggle with it, we'll talk about it on, what is it? It's Monday the 2nd of March when I'll be back. Okay? Any questions about what we did today? No? I'll let you guys start working.